Welcome to the Talking Precision Medicine podcast, brought to you by Genialis. I'm your host, Raphael Rosengarten, CEO and co-founder of Genialis. On this podcast, we discuss the future of healthcare and health technology, and how advances in data and data science are fueling the next industrial revolution. Please subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for more information on Genialis and our unique approach to AI-driven precision medicine, please visit our website at www.genialis.com. That's www.genialis.com. Now, on to the show. Hey everybody, I'm joined today by my colleague Mike Montalto. Mike is Vice President of Precision Medicine at Amgen. Amgen, as many of you know, is one of the most successful pharmaceutical companies out there in terms of getting drugs through R&D and to market. And I think, no doubt, some of their success comes from their advantage on precision medicine. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Raphael. Nice to be here.
Maybe before we get into exactly what you do at Amgen, you can just tell us a little bit about your career trajectory so far. How did you come to be Vice President of Precision Medicine, and what does that mean to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it feels a little circuitous, sort of the route that I took to get here. But just in terms of background, I come more from a technology IBD background. So my classical training, PhD in cell molecular and postdocs in cardiovascular drug discovery, so sort of standard things in our space. And then I wound up in General Electric, spent almost 15 years there doing things like inventing molecular imaging agents and getting into the sort of cross-functional, cross-disciplinary types of research and innovation. I was a lead inventor of proteomic technology called multiomics, which is still on the market today. Spun out a digital path company for them as well called Omnics back in the day, and worked in that company for a while to commercialize that and kind of create regulatory pathways and commercial pathways for that. And then wound up in Bristol Myers Squibb, where I ran translational sciences for them. Our team was, for example, heavily involved in development of the PDL1 28/8 assay for many of our depot portfolio. Ran a lot of their biomarker technologies there, and then went to Path AI, where I was a CSO for developing AI-based pathology products and launched many of those, and then came back into pharma. So I've sort of bounced around in and out of pharma tech and loved what Amgen was doing, saw how they were sort of growing in the space of not just oncology, but they had a vision for precision medicine beyond oncology and across all therapeutic areas, and kind of coming from a multidisciplinary background that I was coming from, I felt like, I could add some value in helping build out the organization here. So that's kind of where I landed here in Amgen about a year and a half ago.
That's fantastic. That sounds like a truly fascinating journey. A couple of questions just out of curiosity. Were you a co-founder at Path AI, or did they recruit you into the C-suite?
No, I was not a co-founder. Short answer. I had known Andy Beck. I don't mind telling the story because it's kind of an interesting story. When I came to BMS back in the day, I was obviously a strong believer in what digital pathology and AI could do in the translational space specifically. And the first call that I made was to Andy Beck at the time, who's now the CEO of Path AI. At the time, he was at Harvard still. And I called him and I said, "Hey, I really want to collaborate with you." And he said, "I'm starting this company called Path AI. Nobody really knows about it yet." And I said, "Well, let us be one of your first customers." And don't, well, the first thing I said to him is, "Don't do it. It's a terrible idea. You're going to go out of business." and especially because he was going after the clinical market, which we can talk a little bit. I'm sure from your perspective, it's resonates. But I said, I really think there's a market in pharma. I have a really big need here. And if you don't mind working with me. And so we did. And so we worked together for a couple of years. And so my decision to join on the C team with him was after a couple of years of doing some really fun work and publishing AI-based pathology activity in the translational space. And then I realized I think we can, if I could work with every pharma, I'd be happy to do that. That's kind of how I wound up, going there.
That's how, it's really interesting. Just on a side note, my company, Genialis, literally just today, our new chief scientific officer announced that title, that role. And he was also on the customer side. He was a pharma collaborator for years,
Ah,
and we
perfect.
recruited him in, and now he's our CSO. So that
Yeah.
that resonates. You want to work with
Yeah.
people you like. And
Good move for you guys. Congratulations on that.
so I'm already way off script, but I have so many questions just from your intro. Having spun out a digital pathology company at GE, was that something leveraging artificial intelligence or math like that, or was it something else?
Yeah, it's a good question. No, at the time, so this was in 2008-ish or so. So at the time, AI wasn't even a term people used. It was still image analysis or regression analysis or whatever. So no, we spun it out because we believe we were coming from an imaging modality in radiology, and there was a belief that this would be a great adjacency to grow into if we could get pathology images to be digital. There's a whole host of things we can do, including image analysis. So yes, that was a part of it. But at the time, the technical challenges that had to be solved were things like image quality and speed and data storage, sort of some basics that GE had the wherewithal from their radiology experience to know how to deal with. That said, I think we're a little ahead of our time. I think what we're seeing now with the adoption of digital pathology is a result of AI and the ability to build, predictive models at scale using, foundation models instead of kind of individual image analysis based models for everything that you want to do. So it's sort of the timing of this is perfect. You needed to have everything digital in order to kind of set the stage for AI to be as powerful as it's going to be. So in some ways, this sort of timing's worked out. But no, I did not have the foresight to think that we would have the AI capability that we have today back when we started the company.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I guess it's a little bit analogous to, omics companies, NGS companies in the aughts and tens were doing a lot of bioinformatics, right? Or comp bio, and now it's all AI on top of that stack.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly right. And it just unlocks so much more than would have been possible. You even thought could have been possible back then.
I do want to dive into more of to your work today, but you said something just a moment ago that first I'd like to dig into a little. When you called Andy, he was mentioning clinical use cases, and you said there's a pharma business to be built here. Can you distinguish between those two and maybe talk a little bit about back then, what were the differences in those two markets? And today, what are the differences? What are the implications if you're building a startup today and you're thinking, I could sell here, or I could sell here, you know?
Yeah, it's a great question. My advice to oftentimes to people who are in the biomarker space or the omics space is to try to capture both of those markets. From a strategic perspective, the pharma market is a market that's paying today and is not sort of saddled with reimbursement challenges, et cetera. They can pay for their particular use cases, provided that there's value there. The clinical space, on the other hand, is a much larger market, as you probably know. So the scale of a clinical market is much bigger, but it's just much harder to get to because of for regulatory and market access and payment and all those reasons that we all know about. So if you can do both, it's great. And I think if you can, I think the advice I had to Andy was if you can stage this in a way where you can build a business and your tech stacks for pharma. And the pharma use cases are somewhat similar, but also distinct. I think the translational space in pharma in pathology is probably the same in molecular as well. You're talking about understanding mechanism of action. You're looking for new pharmacodynamic biomarkers. You're looking for new patient expansion opportunities where you can move into new patients. You're looking for combination strategies. All of those things are value propositions to pharma, none of which are necessarily clinical in the sense that you're out there in the healthcare provider space. But you can sort of build, as you know, right? You can kind of build that technology and use cases. So and then the other thing I think that pharma often, to be really successful in pharma, is to translate now this into clinic in a forward way, ideally patient selection stratification. And so there, if you're a startup company, my advice also is if you are going to play in the translational space, you have to have an eye towards the translatability into the regulatory clinical space where you can scale and potentially even create a companion diagnostic if you need to. It's hard for pharma to embrace a purely translational technology that won't fully translate into market access if you're selecting patients. It's one thing if you're, I know I'm kind of droning on here to Raphael a little bit, but
No, this is absolutely fascinating to me, and I think to my listeners as well. Please keep going.
yeah, good. Okay. Yeah. It's one thing I think if you have a technology that's purely research, and as I was saying in my intro, I was one of the co-inventors of spatial proteomics, the multi-omics platform. So in that case, I never thought that would be a clinical application. It's just too cumbersome. It takes too long. It's very expensive, but it's a great discovery tool. And one could discover pathways and markers that you can then whittle down into a practical test that you can take forward, whether it's IHC or duplex or whatever, PCR in the case of molecular, or now NGS panels you can do, targeted panels. So it's not to say that there isn't a space and that you always have to take a technology straight into CDX, but there does need to be a path for it. So in the case of spatial proteomics, the path is to bring it into a smaller panel and maybe ideally into an IHC. That's standard once you go from 10,000 proteins to one. That's the one that's really most relevant, or maybe a multi-omic approach if you can do that. But so that's kind of what I mean. And so if you can build that out, kind of create that pathway. The interesting thing about a company like Path AI or others in the digital path space is when it comes to the clinical applications of digital pathology, you're just talking about reading slides in a digital environment and creating all of the efficiency gains that one can get there. So they can actually be in the clinical space and not have to have a new biomarker. They're creating a footprint, so to speak, of being out there in the world. And so you can kind of play, you can have a foot in both of these different places. You can be creating new biomarkers in the translational space. At the same time, you're trying to create a footprint. And if you look at all the companies in that space right now, they're racing to get that footprint because really, I think in the end of the day, that's going to be the big differentiator and probably value driver is the footprint. Where can I go and put my test out there?
I mean, I've seen startups in DigPath that aren't even doing interpretation. It's just digitizing the pathology.
Exactly. Yeah. And once you can get there, and I think you can create the footprint, you've got a little bit of a pathway that you can get to
No,
clinic.
that's fascinating. One last question, and I swear we'll get back on script.
Yeah, no, that's fine. No, I like this.
So
Yeah.
I love this observation that, there's all this translational utility in pharma to these kinds of, we'll call them biomarker technologies or precision medicine technologies. But there has to be at least a vision to a place where this touches patients, right? Some of us who do this, though, we run into what feels like often when we talk to pharma, a kind of fear of or a reticence to even think about having to do a CDX. There's either a lot of well-founded or poorly founded feelings that, like, yeah, we want to just develop our drug and have it work for everyone. We don't want to have that CDX. And how do you personally see that? And then maybe we can talk a little more with your Amgen hat on.
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I've been in many meetings within pharma where we discuss that specifically. Should we select or should we not? Do we enrich or not? I think it's easy to say we in pharma just want to have an all-comer population as a default. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I would state it more as we want to have the biggest impact on patients as we possibly can. And when you start reducing a patient population, no test is perfect. No test has 100% MPV and PPV, negative predictive value, positive predictive value. So, by definition, you're going to exclude patients who can respond depending on where you set your cut point. And this is why cut point setting is so critical. It means a lot to a patient who may benefit from a therapy and be excluded from it for label purposes. So if you're in pharma, you take that really seriously. And I think that if one can have a reasonable all-comer strategy and reach as many patients, albeit you'll have some false positives in scenarios like that, which you can potentially tackle later by going after resistance mechanisms within those patient populations. It's why I see this as a preferred strategy as the go-to first. Here's a perfect world. You imagine a pie chart and, maybe there's 10 biomarkers. And if you get all 10 with the right therapy, you get 100% of that patient population is being treated. The problem in the world that we live in today is you can't figure out what those 10 biomarkers and therapeutic strategies are all at once. Can only do kind of one at a time. So if you do 10% and cure 10% of the patients, you got 90% of the patients have to wait for the next 10% and the next 10%. And that's just not palatable, really. So you try to get as many as you can and then worry about resistance mechanisms and then getting to those patients next. And that's how I do think that pharma thinks about it. And the clinical data is critical in terms of really deciding whether or not you will need a selection strategy. And you know this as well too in the space of molecular targeted therapies. Sometimes you're lucky enough to have an a priori, hypothesis or mechanism that obviously, KRAS G12C. Obviously, we're going to select those patients for that targeted mutation, but that's not always the case. So then we have to really struggle with how do we select these patients. So hopefully that's helpful. That's how I see it from the inside.
No, that is very helpful in thinking about it. All right, backing up literally on top of the script, I want to understand a little more about what all your job entails at Amgen, and for someone as VP of Precision Medicine, what aspects of discovery and development are you involved in, and Let's talk about oncology, but also your observation that Amgen was doing some of this outside of oncology is, I think, critical to explore.
Yeah, definitely. It's not just for oncology anymore, I think, precision medicine. So we have a really broad view of precision medicine at Amgen. And it was actually one of the first interview questions that I remember asking was, what is Amgen's definition of precision medicine for a role like this? And I think the classic definition is right patient, right time, right drug. We think of that as sort of molecularly targeted. I think what Amgen has a much broader definition, and in reality, it's more of a translational and precision medicine approach than just precision medicine. So when we think about precision medicine at Amgen, we're covering everything from reverse translation, using our clinical data as well as real world data to make informed decisions about targets and mechanistic approaches for new target identification, potentially validation, all the way to getting ready for first in human trials using biomarker selection strategies if we need them, pharmacodynamics, any safety biomarker signals that we may need to, everything, right? Then we get into the early trials, combination strategies, any data that we can use, any surrogate data to help us make early decisions. ctDNA is a great example in that space, for example, all the way through to potentially needing CDX. So the short answer to your question is it's a comprehensive view, everything from early research all the way through to supporting even our commercial teams on the launch of a new biomarker that we may need out in the market. So, and then like to round out what you're asking about outside of oncology, we're covering all therapeutic areas. So in Amgen, that's oncology, cardiometabolic, obesity, rare diseases, and inflammation. So everything I just said applies to every one of those areas as well.
That's super helpful. I think more and more of these therapeutic areas are coverable as we figure out how to, what the right analytes are to collect and how to analyze them.
Yeah.
How have you seen, since you've worked in a lot of different facets of this, how have you seen the field kind of grow, change, evolve, both in terms of the diseases, the data modalities, the way people are approaching it?
Yeah. The field of precision medicine, you mean?
Yeah,
How's that
yeah.
sort of evolved?
Because I'm thinking like you go back 20 years and it's like measuring mutations with PCR, and it's mostly in oncology because we think of those as genetically defined or.
Yeah, and interesting, I think the first, people always harken back to HER2 as the first real case of IHC in selecting patients. I remember cholesterol as being like the poster child for selecting a patient population and treating a risk factor, and even before HER2 came around. So in some ways, we're kind of coming back to potentially where it started, thinking about precision medicine outside of oncology. Amgen has olpasiran and Lp(a), which is potentially going to be a new, very important independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease. I think that space hasn't had something like that in quite a long time, since cholesterol in general. I do think we're seeing it evolve into other areas. In my Path AI days, and even here at Amgen too, a lot of discussion around ulcerative colitis and selecting patients and having much more finer, precise measurements of histological remission and histological pharmacodynamic markers that can help us advance drug programs more efficiently, maybe even select patients, imaging biomarkers. So in terms of the space evolving, I think certainly evolving outside of oncology is one. I think even extending our definitions of what is a biomarker to accurately select patients. It was always something measurable out of blood, so to speak, or tumor. Now you're seeing really great literature around EMR data as being predictive of disease prognosis or even response. That's awesome. If I can get the same predictive power from data out of an EMR that I can get out of a complex multi-omic test, I'll take the EMR data any day. So that I think that's probably something we're seeing evolving. I think, early detection in cancer, I think is going to be a potentially new thing. A lot of literature coming out in multi-omic technologies and how we can predict. I think there was a Nature Medicine paper not too long ago. It was like within weeks where they were doing a multi-omic approach to, this was in a late line cancer, comparing it to sort of real world control arms and basically doing a single cell. Can you imagine that? Like taking patients, this is prospectively doing single cell analysis on their tumors and then kind of refining their therapeutic approaches and seeing if they had better outcomes. This is kind of the holy grail. And they did two things in that work. They showed that you could operationalize a complex test, which I think was impressive. And then they showed that those patients had stronger responses compared to synthetic controls, in a last line therapy setting. On the one hand, I see all of this new technology coming to bear, and what you would hypothesize that multi-biomarkers are better than single biomarkers is becoming a true statement. I can get, highly predictive power out of EMR and large data sets. That's a true statement. Everything that we think would be true is becoming true, and we're seeing it in the literature. Translating it into real practice is, a different story. So when we think about has precision medicine evolved in the clinic in such a way that we're seeing patient benefit differently over the past decade, I'm not sure. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, actually. You're very close to that as well. I don't know if we're seeing it penetrate the clinic as rapidly as we all wanted it to. Not to say that it's not.
Hey gang, I hope you're enjoying this episode of Talking Precision Medicine, powered by Genialis. We'll be back in just a moment. It's like Mike Montalto said in the top half of this episode. If we can only identify and treat 10% of the patients at a time, 90% are left waiting, and that's just not acceptable. To move faster, we need better tools to capture the full picture of each patient's biology. This week, Genialis is at the year's biggest computational biology event, the ISMB ECCB 2025 in Liverpool, England. We're sharing our latest work on a new confidence metric, something we call pQAL, that enables us to better interpret variant calls from RNA sequencing reads. Now, we can get the entire transcriptome and all the coding region variants from a single RNA-seq run. Find the link to our poster in the description of this episode. And now back to the conversation. Yeah, I think this maybe is a Captain Obvious kind of statement that, the pace of technological innovation is going to far outstrip what doctors are going to adopt.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
And for any number of reasons, I'm not placing the blame on doctors, but they're the top down forces of what's going to get reimbursed. Right. And then, what are people going to learn, and changing practice is hard. And, I'm here in Houston. Most of the conversation here around this is around clinical practice and doctors, not so much around pharma, at least in this
Yep.
town. Right.
Right.
Probably different on the coasts. And, what I keep hearing from my friends who are physicians and from the CIOs is, if it's going to complicate my practice or even require me to learn new tricks, I'm not so interested in it. It's got to fit in kind of seamlessly. And I think the inertia iceberg is kind of mostly there, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, you're right about technology sort of always outpacing. But then you're touching on another point, which is sort of the behavioral psychology of the practitioner. And even if you can serve up the perfect test at the right time for them, how readily is their behavior going to change? And we know, things like reimbursement certainly changes people's behavior. Regulations change people's behavior. So,
But maybe what you pointed out, if the tests were ultimately based more on EHR, real world data, or even things like cholesterol, which you're just going to get measured in your blood, and the AI were automated in the system, so the doctor is getting a flag, as opposed to a new test that requires being up on the literature, sending the sample off to some distant lab, et cetera. I mean, that's just easier to adopt. That's all.
yeah, I agree. I think like everything that AI is being able to change, patients themselves, I would think are going to become more informed, more easily informed than they have it. They already are. But I think in the new world, I was redesigning the front of my house using ChatGPT the other day as as a make-believe architect, because I could. Not to say that I'm going to go get permits to do it, but as a patient, you be able to take a much more active role and sort of almost demanding changes being made by your practitioner. So that someone could see that happen too, I suppose.
Yeah, these are two conversations I've been involved in. One a lot recently. One is this idea of trying to automate sort of the clinical guidelines. And actually at ASCO, Concert AI had a big announcement about now having a software tool that automates all of the ASCO guidelines for practice. We have a dream in Genialis of collapsing the NCCN guidelines for molecular testing in lung cancer from 5,000 decision points to one, right? Let's sequence once and know all the things, right?
Yeah.
But thinking about how patients get put into the loop in the product design, I think is crucial and something we don't talk about enough. Maybe between ChatGPT and our Apple Watches, it'll all kind of come to us. Let's talk about wearables a little bit.
Yeah.
What are you guys, or what are you allowed to disclose that you guys at Amgen are thinking about wearables in some of the non-oncology settings?
So certainly, we have a digital biomarkers group as do many pharma, I think, and sort of exploring to what extent I think can wearables, streamline our trials, decentralize the collection of data points. Just one small example of something like that could be that we've been thinking about has been obstructive sleep apnea for our MariTide program. These comorbidities associated with obesity, there are many of them. And sleep is tough to measure. You got to go into a sleep lab, you have EEGs and et cetera, and have those done under supervision and stuff. So there are companies out there, I won't name them here, but you could provide that data and much more with a wearable device. And so it makes, if you think about that, it makes that trial way less expensive. Sleep studies are not cheap, more accurate probably. I've never been in a sleep lab, but I already don't sleep well in my own house. So I can only imagine what it would be like sleeping in a sleep lab. So I think you probably get more accurate data and you get many more data points and it's quantitative. So, I mean, you can apply that concept to almost all wearables that are endpoint related. I think in that case, that's a particularly relevant endpoint in the space of sleep. But one can imagine cardiovascular or even continuous glucose monitoring, all of those things. So we certainly are thinking about that and piloting, to the extent that we can to see how those are going to impact our trials. Yeah.
But, you had mentioned, for example, ctDNA earlier as a surrogate.
Yeah.
I mean, the point here is depending on what you have to measure, you still want it to be as non-invasive as possible,
Yes.
right? And that's sort of the promise of circulating molecules. It's the promise of wearables. It's meet the patient where they are, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's really come a long way. It's that going back to your question about what's been evolving. Blood-based markers, I think, are evolving significantly. I think the technology around epigenetic testing out of blood, that as a surrogate, so to speak, for local tumor testing, when we think about looking at promoter and enhancer region and histone-based signatures that can tell us is a certain protein biomarker being expressed, that's kind of game changing. If one does not need to have tumor biopsy and you can kind of begin to get these protein surrogates out of blood, I think that could be game changing. Still very early days as to whether or not that, can become a reality or not. But that's something we're certainly keeping an eye on. But anything blood, you look in the NASH space, another comorbidity associated with obesity. And right now, the diagnosis of NASH is liver biopsy. Those are tough, difficult tests to get. They're invasive. And there's a host of non-invasive blood-based testing that can be predictive of fibrosis and the other signatures of NASH. So in almost every facet of precision medicine that we're dealing with, not just in Amgen, but I'm sure everywhere, we're looking for the most, efficient, non-invasive way that's going to give us the most information. And that would be clinically relevant. So, again, you got to translate these somehow into a clinic and scale them.
Yeah. And I think that clinical relevance, I keep coming back to it, as my company plays mostly in the omics and molecular space. And they're just the most amazing things we can learn from the data. And then figuring out how you're going to get that data at scale is always the question.
Yeah. Thinking of scale, I know I'm going to go off the rails here a little bit, but again, getting back to my pathology roots. There was a recent study came out of the Broad and MIT, I want to say. I don't know if you heard that or if you learned about this at all, but it was imageless-based spatial transcriptomics. And somebody who was an imaging guy. I've been in imaging most of my career. There are a few times in my career where my head has almost exploded to think that this is even possible. One time, for example, the idea that you could predict molecular phenotypes from H&E, which we should come back to as a topic. When the Caudry paper came out in Science, that first came out in 2018, and I remember writing a commentary on it, I thought, there's no way. This is not possible. You can't do it. Now it's like very commonplace to predict molecular phenotypes from H&Es. So this paper came out and they at a Broad and they were essentially taking, you still got to take a tissue section, but you lay it over, diffusion matrix essentially. And the premise is this: if you knew where every city in the United States was in relation to every other city, but you had no image, you could recreate the image perfectly just by knowing that. So if you know where every gene is diffusing and the rate at which they're diffusing to every bead, and then you take that out and sequence it, you can recreate the image almost perfectly. So why does that matter? Because spatial transcriptomics is very important. And it's another orthogonal piece of data that supports, all of our mechanistic information. And it's not scalable because imaging is not scalable. Unfortunately, collecting photons and doing it in a way that's meaningful is very difficult and I think will never be changed. So one has to get away from the idea of imaging. And so that's one way to do it.
You could imagine deploying that on a small chip anywhere in the world. Right?
Yeah. Just with a tissue section. So yeah, there are these kind of mind-blowing advances that you never think could even be possible wind up being impossible. So I'm a big fan of that kind of innovation that helps us scale. Scale is so important, I think, in the space that we are in right now. And anything that can help us with that, I think, is key. And going back to the H&E story, I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts on this as well, because we can now predict, transcriptomic-based information using H&Es. And that's also very powerful. I don't know to what extent. First of all, you have to build models for that. You have to have enough data to do it. And then you've got to get into the accuracy of those things. My sense is right now they're good for first pass screens or tests. I don't think yet we're at a place where we can rely on a surrogate, an H&E giving us a surrogate of molecular phenotypes yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I've probably seen a lot of the same papers and use cases on that as one another. I think it's clearly the proofs of concept are there. The question is, how generalizable is that going to be? And it's already tricky enough to generalize a molecular signature to clinical utility, right?
Yes.
That's not to say I don't believe it'll happen. It's just I keep being wrong when I predict how slowly things are going to advance, and then all of a sudden they're here already. And I actually want to use it as a chance to pivot to something I was wrong about recently, was just how fast the FDA is going to adopt AI as something they're using, but also probably something they're going to mandate of pharma. And and just kind of to put all this together, it's like if you're going to the FDA and saying, well, we're doing an H&E scan and we've got an AI that back translates to the molecular phenotype. And then we've got an AI that tells you what the molecular phenotype means in terms of therapy selection. I think that's going to be something we use a lot in the future. I just don't know how soon, because those are two big leaps of faith instead of, one big leap of faith.
I totally agree with you. So the practical use case of a prediction from H&E is in instances where we have large cohorts of patients and we don't happen to have a molecular phenotype on them. And back in the day when I think of my BMS days, we had TMB was emerging as a biomarker, and we just didn't have TMB done. We didn't collect samples for it. But if you could infer it from H&E, that would have at least filled a gap of data that we had at the time. So I think that's a practical use case today. Using it in a regulated clinical sense, I think we're still pretty far away from that. The use case that people bring up a lot is pre-screening and then subsequently downstream confirmatory testing. So if we're doing a study on MSI and we don't want to test everybody for MSI or it's a low prevalence, we can do the pre-screening with H&E. It's cheaper in theory. I think the challenge with that is, again, the regulation. I think from a regulatory perspective, you are biasing your patient population by pre-screening them in a pretty sophisticated way. If patients who screen negative are not subsequently downstream tested, is there something bias about those patients who for some reason are screening negative who would impact your trial at the end of the day? And you're actually not going to have that test on the market as a diagnostic. Then I think the agency gets super uncomfortable with that. And I kind of don't blame them. So then you wind up having to do the studies where you're collecting the negative patients and testing them anyway. And then anybody who's doing a budget on a clinical trial just simply wouldn't do the screening test because you got to do it anyway. So you sort of a little bit of a catch-22 on that.
Yeah, it's tricky. I actually think it's these kinds of nuances that in some ways make startup life and building a company in the space so tricky, right? Us startup guys, we have a technology we're enamored with. We see how powerful it could be,
Yes.
right? And it's all the kind of pitfalls and budget considerations that are tricky to game out.
Yeah, you got to have the stomach for that, which you do. And I certainly learned the hard way in a couple of our startups that I did. Yeah, that it's your technology can be great, but all of these other constraints wind up becoming a real challenge, so to speak.
How has it been since coming to Amgen, working with startups, kind of being on the other side of the table? Do you find yourself collaborative? Is there a lot of DIYism over there? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. Sometimes I feel like I'm a startup's worst nightmare because I've done it. And so I can't be fooled at the, value proposition on a PowerPoint. I really look deeply for the value now as being in startup and making sure that you're showing it. On the other hand, when we do tap into a company that really has value, I think it resonates really well with me, and I can see that it's easy to work with them. Your question on DIYism, that's a great question. I used to think that there are just some things pharma won't do, and they won't invest in. AI is a good example where I just thought that they probably aren't going to invest heavily in that space, and it's better to work with other companies to do it. And drawing from my pathology experience, I thought pharma companies aren't going to be building individual AI-based pathology models for every indication and application that they need. So they will have to rely on companies to do that. And that was a reasonable argument for a period of time. Large language models and foundation models and large vision models have absolutely changed the game and changed my opinion on that entirely. Now I do think any pharma company can build as many models as a company like PathAI or anybody else could build if they want to. And it's not that far out of reach for them to be able to do it. The more these models become available to them. So it depends on what you're specifically talking about. Where does it make sense to partner? There are certainly emerging technologies. So we were just talking about imageless spatial transcriptomic. I mean, we're not going to do that. It's very hard. It's very new. The space of, epigenomic profiling, very new. Not a lot of companies are able to do that yet. I'm not sure that we would want to do it on our own. So there is this kind of sweet spot where really relying on the tech, and I'm a big fan of venture capital, big fan. As you know, many of these new technologies would never get off the ground and get to a place where they demonstrate value and have the application if were it not for venture capital who believed in them. So it's huge for me. And I have not shy at all from a pharma perspective to take advantage of that. I think it's great. So we certainly love working with startup and emerging technology companies that venture is funding. So I think there the relationships are good. I'm always looking for those kind of new things that can really push us forward. Some of the things too, and even I talked about large language models, just using language models for our biomarker teams. Yesterday, you had to be a specialized biomarker scientist with analytical capability to interrogate a cohort. Now I think you could verbalize what you want to do, provided you have all of your data in the right place. And that's also going to kind of change the game a little bit too. So, but I think the role for emerging tech companies is always going to be important for a company like ours to make sure that that technology becomes de-risked over a period of time and that the investors have like a long lead time and patience and the stomach for it to get through those initial challenges of promise and then the reality of getting people to buy it. And it's a full contact sport when you're dealing with pharma.
Sure.
And then getting to a place where you've got something that works.
That makes sense. I mean, it's sort of a classical take on, the innovator's dilemma, which, when written, I mean, it still stands the test of time. When written was a revelation, it might feel a bit obvious, but, startups need to be at that bleeding edge of the thing that's a little too hard and too expensive and
Exactly.
maybe not scalable enough for a big company to take on itself, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think we have to rely on that.
We touched on this very briefly a minute ago, but I'd love to get your take on the role of AI in the regulatory process. So, already ChatGPT or OpenAI and the FDA have announced they're working together and they've built something for product review, and it's not really clear what yet, but they might not even know yet, right? They might want to wait and see how the FDA employees use it. I have a hypothesis. I could be wrong. I often am. At IND filing, the FDA in short order will require an AI model in the same way they require a mouse model or this or that, maybe instead of a mouse model. And that's going to have a lot of implications for like, how do you know if it's any good? Like, what does the training data have to look like? What are the parameters of that? Are you guys thinking about that yet? Or are you going to wait and see?
The short answer to your question is yes, we're definitely thinking about it. And I think we are embracing AI very, robustly. We hired Sean Brewitt. He's our SVP of AI, came from Nike, which I also think is a great move that Amgen made. Going back to my GE days, I'm a big believer of having innovation come from many different sources. And I think that was a great take on it. In my own world, I've made it really clear that I'd like to have every biomarker technology and piece of data that we're generating in a traditional way that goes for flow cytometry, immunoassay, imaging, to have some AI component. Doesn't mean we're necessarily going to use it in a regulatory filing, but we're going to have it so that we can learn about it and begin to operationalize it, because that alone is a challenge. When it comes to sort of broader uses, we have relationships with OpenAI as well, as many companies do. We're getting to use it in our everyday lives to try to make our lives more efficient. I think regulatory filings is an interesting area for pharma as well. Can we reduce our cycle time by using AI to help build our submission packages, which are enormous and require a lot of labor and reading? It's an interesting thought experiment to think that you'd have companies building their submission packages using AI. You have the agencies using AI to review them. Where will we be checking the kind of the validity on both sides of that?
Right. Where do the humans in the loop sit?
Yeah,
Sure.
it's interesting. It's like having the two AI models talk to each other. I mean, that the pace of this innovation has far exceeded what most of us would think. So I think we have to embrace it.
Yeah, I was on a panel at Bio last week with Alex Zhoronkov from In Silico Medicine. He was describing a system they've built where they have their older models, which become obsolete over time, train their newer models. And he described almost as having like a brown belt training a black belt.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, the concept of it. Well, with that, let's maybe steer towards the grand finale. I'd like to talk a little bit about the future. Just, parting thoughts on what you're most excited about that's coming down the pipe in precision medicine. That could be technologies, medicines themselves, indications that we can finally get after.
Oh boy, what I'm most excited about. I mean, so many different things. I think that, yeah, in the technology we've talked about, I mean, certainly using AI in these technologies in the future, I'm excited about. I'm very passionate about imaging-based AI technologies penetrating the market, having all the promise that we believe it should. From technology innovations, I mean, things like multi-specific degrader technology. I mean, we say often in Amgen, there's really not a target that we can't drug. We're very innovative in that way. And I think that the emerging platforms that are coming out now are kind of opening up a whole host of possibilities. Multi-specifics are very exciting. Combination strategies. This idea, I think now, of not waiting for resistance mechanism to emerge in full blown, but even do what we saw at ASCO a couple months ago, where, out of ctDNA, we can see an emerging mechanism come up quickly and then treat it immediately. That's fantastic. So one can really kind of imagine getting, especially in the cancer space, getting to very treatable chronic versus, terminal disorders in the not so distant future. And then maybe it's a product of me and the role that I'm in, but I really like to see precision medicine strategies penetrating non-oncology spaces now. Very excited about LP(a) in the Amgen world. And I think spaces like rare disease and inflam, even obesity. As yes, do you need a biomarker to know if somebody's lost weight? Probably not. Weight loss is a good biomarker, but will we treat 40 million patients all the same? Definitely not. So one has to really be thinking, this is another space like AI that has taken us very quickly to a place where we didn't exist 3 years ago to an enormous opportunity to help patients. And so we have to think hard about what are precision medicine strategies going to be in the space of obesity and all of its comorbidities, and how quickly can we catch up in that space? We've been doing it in oncology for 30 years. We've been doing it in the space of obesity for 3 years. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And I think we will see, a lot of work happening in that space as well. So I'm kind of excited to see how that, unfolds over the next few years.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I was at a discussion around Project Optimus, which is the FDA sort of guidance on new approaches to dose finding and so forth. And the speakers kept coming back to this idea of needing tools to help relate dose to reaction or dose to response. And in the obesity world, what you're finding is that, companies developing obesity drugs will often be targeting weight loss goals as clinical endpoints that are actually far beyond what the patients themselves want. And patients will end up titrating their dose back
I agree.
because maybe they don't need 30% weight loss, maybe 20 is enough. But to be able to dial in the sort of dose to response for things like obesity and metabolic diseases and so forth would be very helpful.
I absolutely agree. I think you're seeing patients sort of naturally find maintenance doses on their own.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
That's how fast the space is evolving, right? I see this with my own relationship with family members. We were like, well, I've titrated back. I like the weight loss that I'm at. So now I'm at, I'm doing this and doing that. I'm like, you're just creating a maintenance dose for yourself. So certainly, and real world evidence will be really important in that respect as well. We didn't talk a lot about that, but I'm very excited about that as well. If you can capture that, what we just said, across millions of patients in real world settings, and use large language models to interrogate that and then come up with what our maintenance doses should be in the real world, that can translate quickly into trials for us and, potentially have almost like human experiments being done for us. And then we can go ahead and do clinical trials to validate what we think is already happening. That could also accelerate.
All right, last question. If we, and here I mean we collectively, you and your team at Amgen and myself and all the others, if we do our jobs well, how does medicine look different in 10 years?
Yeah, I think patients have this, if we do it well, they've got access to testing and test results quickly. I think if they're paid for, I think we're leveraging the best technology. And as we said at the top of this, even physicians are embracing it in a way, it's demystified and easy to use. And I think I've heard this on some of your podcasts in the past where you're saying instead of precision medicine, it's just medicine. And we used to say that about digital pathology. There'll be no such thing. It'll just be pathology. We're probably getting there. So I think if we do it right, we should get to that space, where it's just medicine is being done, but in a precision way.
Fantastic, Mike. Well, we will certainly work towards that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Raphael. This is fantastic. I appreciate it.
This has been another episode of the Talking Precision Medicine podcast, brought to you by Genialis. Hopefully by now you've subscribed to the show, but if not, go ahead and click that subscribe button and leave us a review. And please do pay us a visit at www.genialis.com. That's www.genialis.com to learn more about how AI is transforming precision medicine. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.